My name is Javen, and this is my humble garage. Today I want to talk you through a little mod that I made to my Miata, my NA Miata, which is right there. And what it is it's seat shakers. Now you might say, well, the Sensory sound system had seat shakers from the factory. Why do we need a write-up on how to put them in a Miata? Well, if you're anything like me, if you have a roll bar or you just prefer NB seats don't have an option for seat shakers. So whether you want to take your stock Miata wiring for your NA seats and adapt it to your NB seats so you can keep your shakers, or if you just want to add shakers to your seats because you didn't have them before and you missed the bass, this might be a really good option for you. Now, shakers are awesome because they give you the feeling of bass without having to hear the sound, and that is great for convertibles because convertibles lose low frequency sound very easily in the wind. This allows you to kind of get some of that back without actually having to hear it. And as we know, there's not a lot of space for a sub in an area that you can hear really well in a Miata without going big. So big that you annoy other people. And for me, I like to have a really stealthy kind of presence in my Miata when I'm off throttle. So this turned out to be a really good option for me. So I tore apart my passenger seat, did a bunch of recon, so to speak, on how I wanted that to look, how I wanted it to feel, where I could use certain things, where I couldn't use certain things, where I had space, all that stuff. And then I went through and I recorded as much as I could while I did the kind of finished and more detailed version on the driver's seat once I had kind of torn up my passenger seat and gotten a lot of things wrong. So I'm going to walk you through that now. If you have any other questions on how I did it, that'd be great. I can answer them in the comments. To go through it really high level, seat shakers are great, but in the NB seats, they're hard to fit. Modern puck transducers make it a lot easier, but they're small. So instead of doing one transducer, I made a bracket that holds two of them. They're made by Dayton Audio. They're small pucks. I used the 16 ohm version, and I wired them all in parallel to a single channel amplifier. Now I'm going to walk you through all the details of how I did it. It takes a little bit of time, so I apologize for the length, but it should cover most of the things that you need to know. So yeah, there's nothing else to say. So here's the walkthrough. All right, so the first step is pretty easy. You're gonna go ahead and pull these zippers out from underneath where they're tucked in underneath the upholstery. So pull them out and then zip both sides up the back. Now what this is gonna do once you zip those both up is you're going to expose your upholstery connections, the hog ring specifically here. So each one of these sets of holes has a hog ring in it. What you're gonna do is you're just gonna take a side cutter or dikes, whatever you wanna call it, and cut each one of those off and pull them out. And once you do that, this flap will just lift up out of the way. So what we're gonna do then is we're going to make sure your upholstery is out of the way. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna measure up each side of the seat a certain distance and then cut out the foam. And the reason we're cutting the foam out instead of just making a mount over top is because we want it to be inset, so that way you don't lose any of your distance from moving your seat backwards or forwards on your sliders. So to measure this, what you're gonna wanna do is you're gonna wanna go from the bottom of the foam here up about 6 inches. Now that puts you right about in the area of the frame between these two bolts that hold the main support. And what's nice about that spot is that I found it has one of the flatter profiles of the seat frame, because other places on the seat frame are very round. So this will give you a nice flat spot that you can weld your bracket to. Now I already made my bracket, so I can't really detail that for you without in process, but all you need is a piece of like 1 inch to 7/8 inch wide or thick bar material. Steel is fine. Everything in the seat frame is already rusty, so a little bit more rusty metal isn't gonna be a problem. If you cut this open, you're gonna find that they're rusty. You can't see it yet though. And then these two pieces of metal are actually 4-inch galvanized covers for electrical boxes. So those are easy to find. You just have to make sure when you weld them that you grind off all the galvanization or they won't weld properly. So these are just kind of quick and dirty MIG welds. that I did on both sides to make sure there wouldn't be any vibration, to make sure that the force would be transferred well through the transducer into the seat frame. So what you're going to do then is you're going to mock up what you want to cut out onto your seat foam, maybe trace it out with a permanent marker, which is what I'm going to do, and then cut your depth into the seat about until you feel your knife probably start to click across the seat supports, which is like the wire basket frame. And you don't want to go any deeper than that. And then at that point you have two options. The best thing I found is a serrated bread knife, going in this way and then cutting kind of along and through, and I'll take a video of that when I get to that point. And that will kind of allow you to pull the width and the thickness of it out. So you'll make your lines across deep, and then you'll take a bread knife to kind of pull the foam out as neatly as possible. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that so you can see it, and we'll move on to the next step here. Now I actually bought a hot knife to try and do this more efficiently, but it broke the first time I tried to use it. So my best thing that I've found so far is to just use a box cutter with a brand new blade, nice and sharp, and do slow multiple cuts with a little bit of an upward and downward motion to get the kind of slicing action going. In a few runs through the material, you should be able to get through it pretty easy. You'll notice the top layer is kind of a thicker cell, like more dense foam, and then as you get into it, it'll feel more like a almost like a filler foam, like as if it was injected in there. And it's much more difficult to cut without bunching it up. So you're gonna wanna go slow and really just kind of take your time cutting through it if you want it to look neat. At some point, you're gonna realize that keeping the top seat back bolted on is more pain than it's worth. So you're gonna take out two 14 millimeter bolts on this side and one 8 millimeter bolt here. And then the seat will just turn slightly this way and come off the bottom there, and that'll give you a lot more better access to all the work you're going to do here, especially when we get into the welding part. So I would go ahead and do that pretty much right away as soon as you start the project. All right, once you have your foam cut out, you can go ahead and lay your bracket that you made in the holes that you cut out, just to make sure everything lines up. Now, when you cut out your foam, what you want to do is you want to make sure you cut a deeper section out here by the support. Because what I do is I leave a little bit of foam between the wire basket in here and the brackets you're making. That's because when these things vibrate, you don't want them rattling against the wire basket in here. So then when you get to the edges, you want to go deeper so that way you can reach the metal frame underneath and give yourself some clearance for room there. Then what you want to do is you want to put this on here, and you'll see I curved the ends so they go over that extra foam into contact with this spot. Now, you might have to grind the edges of your bracket here so that it lays flat, because each side has slightly different contours. So I'm gonna go ahead and clean up this foam a little bit here, and then we'll go ahead and what you have to do in order to get a good weld is you really need clean metal. So I'm gonna have to put a wire brush in here and get this all totally clean down to nice bare metal, and that can eat up a little bit of your foam, but don't worry about that too much. The leftovers that you have from cutting out the space there, if you have anything where you lose too much foam, you can cut this up and put that in your space, just so you make sure you don't have any of the holes showing in your upholstery. Brackets themselves are going to be hard welded to your seats, so getting behind these brackets while the foam is in there is going to be really difficult. So in order to get around that, what I'm doing is I'm taking the hardware here, which is 6-32 hardware. We're going to run it through the holes that I have lined up in the brackets, weld it in place, and then we'll have studs in place where the speakers are going to go. Now this is going to make it really easy to take these on and off if they ever go bad or need to be replaced or repaired or anything like that, without having to try to get a wrench or something behind the bracket with all the foam in place. So the problem I had with the first set that I did on my passenger side, which was the proof of concept for this project, was that the nuts, which look like this, were actually too big for the speaker itself, because the speaker had a lip that this nut wouldn't get around, so you couldn't tighten the nut down with this size nut. Now you can find a 632 nut that is actually really, really small and doesn't have nearly this outside diameter. That works great. That's what I have in the other ones, but I couldn't find small nuts like that at the hardware store. So instead, I have two options. I can run an aluminum spacer, which looks like this, to space the nut away from the surface so that I can get it on there, or I can run a threaded spacer and use a vice grip to tighten it down. And this would actually be really nice because it would give me a nice smooth surface as opposed to having the threads stick through the end into my upholstery. So I'm gonna try to use this and see if I can get it tight enough. If I cannot, then I'm gonna go with the spacer and then the nut. And then if I still have any threads left showing through, I'm gonna find a way to cap them off so that I don't have any trouble. On this seat, I don't have the pocket behind the seat to give me that kind of buffer if anything does try to wear through the seat. So on this one, I really want to make sure that the end of the threads are kind of capped so that way we don't have any issue with these rubbing through the leather. To kind of sum it up, I just welded right there. Now, the expanding water that I sprayed on there kind of made a couple of little bubbled areas, but the welds are solid. I tapped them with a hammer to make sure that they weren't just pure slag or anything like that. So that worked out well. Didn't have any problems with smoking. As you can tell, it stayed nice and foam colored, and it's not blackened all over the place. So you want to just go slow, maybe do small patches at a time, wait for it to cool down, spray it off with some more water, then do another spot and just kind of slowly go, kind of like you're working on body work that you don't want to warp. Then on the other side, I already have the foam kind of filled back in to give the upholstery the same illusion it used to have before. So when I pull the upholstery back over, you shouldn't see a dip here, which would be nice. So with that done, I'm gonna go ahead and mount everything up, and then we can go through some wiring details and we'll be almost done. Okay, so once you have them all drilled out, I use a 9/64 drill bit to drill out these holes. You can go ahead and place the spacers on here, and then you're going to take your puck, you're gonna stick the 3M pad on there, and then you're gonna peel it off and mount it. So I'm gonna go ahead and mount those on there, and then we're gonna go ahead and get started with wiring. Okay, so one tip, these notches here in the ring have to line up with the wires. That way you make sure you have clearance for them. Okay, so the mounting is done. You'll notice that I used the spacers, the aluminum spacers here, underneath the nut. Now the reason I did that was because the nut wouldn't fit inside this recess, and the spacers gave me the ability to put those nuts on. Now, because this is a vibrating plate, essentially, I made sure that I used blue Loctite to make sure these don't loosen up over time. And I only really put them on as tight as my nut driver could go because they are pretty small bolts. And really, the padding underneath the transducer that comes with it, that 3M sticky tape, essentially, that is going to damp a lot of the movement. So you're not going to get a lot of movement. So that, along with the Loctite, should make it so that the light torque doesn't loosen up. But I've only put a couple of minutes on the system on my proof of concept seat, so that remains to be seen if that's true or not. Anyway, if you look, the mounting is only a little bit outside of flush, which is nice. I would either Dremel these flush or put little rubber caps on them, whatever you want to do. I don't have those parts with me right now, so they're not in the write-up, but that would be a really good idea. Just a couple of tips for when you put these on. Do not pinch these wires. They're very small gauge and you don't want to wreck them. They wreck pretty easily. And then when you take these on and off during your fit up, make sure you take them off evenly. If it gets cocked one way or the other as you're taking it off, it will get very hard for it to be removed. And if you pull on it too hard while it's cocked like that, in any direction other than level, you'll actually probably break these plastic things off. I did that on my proof of concept seat on the passenger seat, and what I ended up doing is I had to rotate the transducer one set of holes in order to get the broken hole not to line up with one of my studs anymore. So be careful for that, because it can definitely happen. All right, so what I actually decided to do when I looked at it a little bit longer is I'm gonna put this piece of foam that came in the box with the puck on top of the puck. It's gonna add a little bit of thickness to the seat, but it's gonna keep these studs that I have left over from wearing through the leather upholstery, and it's gonna kind of even out the pressure against this puck, so that way it won't look quite as circular if you were to look at the back of the seat. Now, I don't know how much I actually care if these show through the seat, because the back of the seat isn't really seen by anyone. As we all know, usually the seats are pushed all the way up against the back of the cabin in the Miata, so even if it's not perfect, really no one's ever going to see it, because it's not like it's a four-seater convertible where you're constantly moving the front seat forward and back to let people in and out of the back seat. So not a huge concern, but I just wanted to see how good I could make it look, so we're going to add that on there and see how that looks. I'm just going to hold it on to the Dayton audio symbol with some hot glue and see if it stays. As long as it doesn't move around while I put the upholstery back on, it really doesn't need to be held on there really well. So I think hot glue should probably do it. All right, so as we move on to wiring, it's going to be pretty simple. You're just going to do a basic parallel setup. So positive to positive, negative to negative, into a single line, which we're going to create a lead for into a connector, so you can pull your seat in and out without having to cut wires. And then we're going to run those connectors from both seats together in parallel as well. So you have a 16 ohm here, a 16 ohm here. Together, that's an 8 ohm load. And then with both seats together, that's 2 8 ohm loads in parallel, meaning you'll have 4 ohms total load for your single channel amplifier that you should be running with these. So that'll be perfect. So what we're doing is we're running them both together, like I said. Just make sure you use flux, make sure you have nice clean wires, and you can kind of see where I am right now. This one's soldered, this one's soldered as well. It's under heat shrink. I use marine grade heat shrink because it has like a hot glue basically inside. So when I heat shrink this, it'll bond to the wire casing, so it'll add some strain relief, so that way it's less likely for the solders to get pulled apart, and then also just add some weather tightness. So I'm going to put that over, and then you'll see I'm going to heat shrink the entire tube here, the entire wire here, to make sure the entire thing looks like a nice professional harness with a connector at the end that I'm going to add, so you can plug and unplug the seats. Now, if you wanted to do this really fancy, you could probably find a way to wire it into the original Mazda amplifiers if you had them, but I just don't like dealing with that stuff. I like just doing my own thing, because dealing with stock wiring and the gauges involved, I don't like having to work through all that. And Mazda was notorious at this time period for not getting their colors right in terms of their wiring. So you kind of have to scope every single individual wire to make sure it actually is going where you think it's going. So I don't want to deal with that. I'm making my own harnesses, and we'll move on from there. All right, so when it's all said and done, this is what we end up with. This guy right here, it's a 3-pin, I know, it's all I had lying around, so I'm only using 2 of the pins in that. That's gonna go down behind the seat and get plugged into this guy. So this is going to get wired into the amp system that I'm going to build. I'm going to do that tomorrow. So that's going to hold back the video a day, but it's pretty late. So we're going to finish this up so I can drive the car tomorrow. All right, so you're just going to go ahead and zip tie your seat upholstery back together. Now, one thing I cannot stress enough is strain relief. You do not want to pull your seats out one day and forget that this is plugged in and have all of your hard work get yanked out of the back of out of the transducers. So at least 1, if not 2, of these zip ties I would wrap around your new harness. That way you do not have the chance of ripping your wires out of your speakers when you forget at some point to disconnect this when you're removing your seat. All right, so go ahead and do that. It's a very, very good idea. Save you a lot of headache in the future. And then you can just go ahead and button your upholstery back up, and then just reassemble your seat in the reverse of the way that you took it apart. All right, so going through the wiring on this is pretty simple. Basically, we have our 2 seat connectors running through a nice heat shrunk harness that I made into a parallel connection where they both go positive to positive and negative to negative into a single speaker wire which comes around, is going to run into our amplifier. Now, this is just all done nice and neat, so that way when you pull up the carpet and stuff, it looks really OEM and really nice and clean. You don't have to go into this level of depth if you don't want to, but this is just how I always tend to do connectors, just because I'm kind of really picky about how the wiring looks in the car. So that's what I did, and that's what the wiring looks like from the speakers to the amplifier. Now, for the amplifier, I didn't have any spare single channel amps lying around, and I really didn't want to spend a lot of time or money picking one out. Also, I didn't want to take up a ton of space, so I did some looking, and this is actually a 100-watt amplifier that you can buy off Amazon for $12. It's really simple. It's probably not a very high quality sound output, but honestly, for a subwoofer, or even more so for seat shakers, you don't need quality. You just need it to run a good signal, so that way you get what you're looking for out of the shakers. So this is what I went with. It had a center positive connector here for voltage. I took that out, cut it out with side cutters, and then soldered in just this 16 gauge speaker wire for a 12-volt supply. And then your speaker hooks up here, and your input goes here. Now, my Bluetooth amplifier, which is the setup that I have, has a preamp output that outputs whatever my Bluetooth is putting into my amplifier. So this will come out of my amplifier and plug right into the mini amplifier here, and that will give me the signal for this. Now, the one thing about this amplifier is that it uses a potentiometer switch to turn itself on and off. And so you really have to have this somewhere you mounted you can reach it to turn it on. And that's not what I want, because my amplifier where I'm getting the signal from is in the trunk, and I want this hidden in the trunk as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up to get power from a relay instead of just direct power from 12 volt, so that it's not always on. So there is a wire in the back of my trunk that runs my, or used to run my electric automatic radio antenna. That has a 12 volt signal when the key is turned on. So what's going to happen is I'm going to have that run a relay to give this 12 volt power or ground when the key is on in the car. And I'm going to set this knob to a level that's where I want it from the seat shakers. Now, I might find over time that I just really want to be able to, I really want to be able to adjust them on the fly. So this might end up getting mounted under the dash somewhere at some point, if I can find a clean spot to put it. But for now, it's just going to be mounted underneath my amp mount in my trunk, which is inside my spare tire. So that's how I'm doing it. You can use the sub channel on your 3-channel or 5-channel amp if you want, or if you have a 4-channel amp, you could run this shaker system off of a bridged second set of channels as well. You have all kinds of options for how you can drive these, as long as you don't overdrive them. They're 20 watts RMS each, and they're 30 watts max each. So you don't want to drive more than 120 watts through them peak, and you don't want to drive more than 80 watts through them RMS. So keep that in mind. It's not a lot of power.
All right, so that is everything I think you really need to know to do this project. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the comments. I'll get back to you as soon as I can and make sure I can help you as best as I can based on what I experienced while doing this. In terms of the parts you need the transducers, an amplifier, and then the surface mount kit for the transducers. I'll try to link all that in the description so that way you can find it easy. And then again, if you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Hope this video gave some of you a little bit of help.